In the 1960s, young black men in the U.S. faced severe systemic racism, economic inequality, and social injustice, despite the rising tide of the civil rights movement. Here's a quick snapshot of the challenges and changes during that decade. The Jim Crow laws in the South enforced racial segregation, denying black men equal rights in education, housing, and public facilities. This legal framework kept many black men in positions of subjugation, reinforcing a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement. Young black men faced educational disparities, with segregated and underfunded schools limiting their opportunities. Employment discrimination also meant many were confined to low-paying, menial jobs, if they could find employment at all. The unemployment rate for young black men was often twice as high as for their white counterparts. The 1960s were a pivotal era, with leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X inspiring millions of young black men to challenge the status quo. The fight for voting rights, desegregation, and economic justice ignited activism, particularly after major events like the 1963 March on Washington and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Black men were disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. Police brutality, alongside racial profiling, sparked tensions in cities like Detroit, Newark, and Los Angeles, where the Watts riots of 1965 became a symbol of urban frustration and rage. Many young black men were drafted into the Vietnam War, fighting for a country that still denied them basic rights. Muhammad Ali, a boxing champion, famously protested the draft, becoming a powerful voice against the war and racial injustice. Black soldiers often experienced racism within the military and faced limited opportunities when they returned home. In summary, the 1960s saw young black men struggling against entrenched racism and inequality, but it was also a period of tremendous activism and hope, as the civil rights movement brought significant social and legal changes. Here is the story of one of the most iconic and powerful moments in Olympic history is the Fists of Glory raised by two African-American athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, during the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games. Their silent protest on the podium became a symbol of resistance, pride, and the enduring fight for racial equality. This story transcended sports and turned into a viral moment of global significance. As we know, the late 1960s was a time of tremendous social unrest, especially in the United States, where the civil rights movement was in full swing. African Americans were fighting for equality, justice, and an end to segregation. Both Tommie Smith and John Carlos grew up in this era, deeply aware of the racial injustice that plagued their communities. Smith was an exceptional sprinter, and Carlos was a fierce competitor in the 200 meters. Both athletes saw the 1968 Olympics as not only an opportunity to compete but also a platform to make a stand. They were inspired by the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Black Power movement. Their hearts were full of pride for their heritage, and they knew they had to use this global stage to speak for those who had no voice. On October 16, 1968, during the 200-meter final, Tommie Smith ran a record-breaking race, winning the gold medal with a time of 19.83 seconds, becoming the first man to break the 20-second barrier. John Carlos followed closely behind, finishing in third place and winning the bronze. But it was what happened next that shook the world. During the medal ceremony, as the national anthem played, Smith and Carlos stood on the podium, heads bowed, each raising a black-gloved fist in the air, an unmistakable symbol of black power and solidarity. Smith raised his right fist to represent black power in America, and Carlos raised his left to represent unity in black America. Both wore black socks with no shoes to symbolize black poverty, and Smith wore a black scarf around his neck to represent black pride. Carlos wore beads to honor those who had been lynched, those who had been murdered, and those who had died at sea during the Middle Passage. The gesture was silent, but the message was deafening. Their peaceful protest sparked immediate controversy. The International Olympic Committee, IOC, deemed their act a violation of the Olympic spirit, which prohibited political statements. Smith and Carlos were expelled from the Games, and they faced severe backlash when they returned home. Both athletes were ostracized, received death threats, and struggled to find employment. But while they faced personal hardship, their message spread like wildfire. The image of the two athletes standing defiantly with their fists raised became one of the most enduring symbols of the civil rights movement. Their bravery resonated with marginalized communities around the world, inspiring athletes and activists alike. In the years that followed, the world began to see Smith and Carlos not as rebels, but as heroes. Their stand against racial injustice paved the way for future generations of athletes to use their platform to speak out on social issues. Their legacy is reflected today in movements like Take a Knee and protests against police brutality. Tommie Smith and John Carlos' Fists of Glory became much more than a fleeting Olympic moment. It became a lasting symbol of resistance, hope, and the ongoing fight for equality. What started as a bold stand in Mexico City has grown into an international reminder of the power of peaceful protest and the need to fight for justice, even when the world isn't ready to listen. Their act of courage showed that athletes can be more than competitors, they can be powerful voices for change. To this day, the raised fists continue to inspire millions around the globe, reminding us that the fight for justice and equality is far from over.